The truck slid sideways across the ice and slammed hard into a snowbank. The engine died. Snow poured against the windshield so thick she couldn't see the hood. A hand clawed at the door handle. It wouldn't open. She threw her shoulder against it again and again until it gave and she fell out into the snow. Her boots sank to the knee. The wind tore the breath right out of her chest. And she was 8 months pregnant, alone, miles from the nearest road that had a name. Her name was Della Marsh, and she was about to freeze to death in the Bitterroot backcountry. Unless she could reach the dark shape of a building, she could just barely see through the white. What she found behind that fireplace changed everything she thought she knew. And why was she still alive at all? Stay with me on this one. She went toward that dark shape because the only other choice was to lie down in the snow and stop moving. And she knew what stopping meant. Tom had told her once, years back, when they were young and stupid and still thought nothing could touch them. You stop moving in cold like this, you fall asleep, and you don't wake up. Tom. 6 weeks in the ground now, and here she was talking to him in her head like he could answer. The building got bigger as she stumbled toward it. A long, low place, the kind they threw up fast and cheap. A government building, maybe. A barn, she didn't care what it was. There was a roof, and a roof was everything. The door was swollen shut in the frame. She hit it with her whole body, what little weight she had that wasn't belly. Once. Twice. On the third try it scraped open and dumped her onto a wooden floor, and the wind followed her in, and then, blessed thing, the door swung half shut behind her and cut the worst of it off. For a long moment she just lay there, breathing. Her hands didn't feel like hands anymore. They felt like blocks of wood somebody had stitched onto her wrists. She made herself sit up, made herself look. It was a single big room, long tables down one wall, shelves. The shapes of things left behind by people who'd left in a hurry or left for good. Nobody had been here in a long time. You could feel it. The cold inside was a different cold than outside, an old, settled, patient cold, the kind that had been waiting in the corners for years. And against the far wall, a fireplace. Big, made of river stone with a stone hearth and a black iron throat, cold as everything else. But a fireplace meant wood and a chimney and a chance. Della got to her knees and then to her feet, one hand on her belly the whole time. The baby kicked hard right under her ribs like it was telling her to hurry up. "I know," she said out loud. "I know, I'm trying." That was when she saw the eyes, low to the floor back in the dark by the shelves. Two pale eyes watching her, not moving. Her heart slammed. A wolf, she thought. Out here it could be a wolf. Then the shape moved and it stood, and it was a dog. A big one, but thin, terribly thin, ribs showing through a coat that had once been thick and was now matted and gray-white. A husky, or most of one. It stood there with its head low and watched her with those pale blue eyes, and it didn't growl, and it didn't come closer. "Hey," Della whispered, "hey now." The dog's tail moved, just once, just barely. She didn't have it in her to be afraid for long. The cold took up too much room. She turned away from the dog and went to the fireplace, and beside it, in an iron rack, there was wood. Old, dry, split wood, a good armload of it, like somebody had laid it there for the next person, and the next person had never come. Her hands shook too hard to do anything useful, so she shoved them under her arms and rocked back and forth until the feeling crawled back into them like fire ants. In her coat pocket, she had a tin of matches. Tom's matches, the waterproof kind he kept in the truck. She'd grabbed the tin without thinking, the way you grab anything of a dead man's that still smells like him. Her fingers fumbled the lid. 3 matches spilled and rolled into the dark. She got the 4th between her thumb and finger. She needed kindling. There were papers on the long table, curled and yellow, and she didn't stop to read them, didn't think about whose work she was burning. She crumpled a fistful, shoved it under the smallest sticks, and struck the match. It went out. The draft from the broken door killed it. The second match she cupped in both wooden hands, leaned in close, and held it to the paper until the flame caught and crept and bloomed. A thin line of fire ran up the edge of the page. Then the kindling caught with a small, dry crackle, the most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her life. The dog came closer while she fed the fire. She felt it before she saw it, a presence at her side, and then a long, low body lowered itself onto the hearthstones next to her, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth of it. It smelled like cold and pine and animal. It didn't beg. It didn't crowd her. It just lay down against her hip and let out a long breath through its nose and watched the flames with her. "You live here?" Della asked it. The dog didn't answer, of course it didn't. But it pressed a little closer, and she found that her hand had come to rest on its bony shoulder, and that under the matted fur she could feel it shivering just like she was. Two starved, freezing things, sharing what little heat they could make between them. She found a collar under all that fur. Leather cracked and stiff, and a metal tag worn almost smooth. She held it to the firelight and turned it until the letters caught. One word, a name, Juniper. "Juniper," Della said. The dog's ears moved at the sound of it, the first real response it had given her, a flicker of something old waking up. "All right, Juniper. We're going to get through tonight, you and me. You hear?" The fire grew. The heat of it pushed the old cold back a foot at a time, and feeling came screaming back into Della's hands and feet, and she sat on the hearthstones with her back against the warm river rock and Juniper pressed along the length of her. And for the first time since the truck went into the bank, she let herself believe she might not die in this place. She thought about Ruth in Missoula, waiting up, calling the highway patrol by now. She thought about how she'd taken the logging cut to save an hour, the way Tom always had, the way she'd promised herself she'd never do because Tom was the one who'd loved a shortcut, and look where shortcuts got you. She thought about the baby, Tom's baby, the one he'd never get to hold, kicking away inside her like it had somewhere to be. She put both hands on her belly and felt the small, hard heel of a foot slide under her palm. "We're okay," she told it. "We're okay now." The fire popped. Sparks went up the black throat of the chimney, and in the new light Della saw something she hadn't seen before. Down low to the right of the firebox, set into the stone, there was an iron plate, a square of it dark with old soot about the size of a dinner plate, and one corner of it stood proud of the stone, lifted, like it had been pried at once and never set right. She almost left it alone. She was warm, finally, and tired down to the bone, and the smart thing was to sleep. But there's a thing in people that can't leave a loose corner loose. She reached out and worked her fingers behind the lifted edge and pulled. The plate came away from the stone with a gritty scrape. Behind it was a hollow, a little black mouth in the masonry, and inside the hollow was a box, a tin box, the kind that held tea or biscuits once with the paint long flaked off. Somebody had set it in there on purpose, deep where the heat of the fire would never reach it, and fitted the iron plate over the hole to hide it. Della drew it out. It was heavier than it looked. The lid was sealed shut with a band of tape gone brown and brittle, and across the lid, scratched into the metal with the point of a knife, was a single line of words. "For whoever comes in from the cold." Della sat very still. Juniper lifted its head off her leg and looked at the box, and then looked at her, and made a sound, the smallest sound, half a whine, deep in its chest. "It's all right," she said, though she didn't know if it was. She peeled the tape away. It came off in flakes. She worked her thumbnail under the lid and pried, and the tin gave up its seal with a soft pop and a breath of dry, old air. Inside, on top, was a photograph. 3 men and a woman standing in front of this very building in summer, squinting into the sun. The men wore work clothes and the easy grins of people who think they've got all the time in the world. The woman stood a little apart, dark hair tied back, one hand resting on the head of a dog. A young dog, broad-chested, thick-coated, pale-eyed. a husky in its prime, and around its neck a leather collar. Della looked from the photograph to the gray, starved animal lying against her side, looked at the pale blue eyes, looked back at the picture. "No," she said softly. "No, that can't be you. That was years ago, that's not." But the dog held her gaze and didn't blink, and something in those old eyes made the hair stand up on Della's arms. Under the photograph there was a knitted baby's hat, small and white, gone yellow with age, wrapped careful in wax paper. And under that a notebook thick, its cover swollen and warped from years in the cold. Della set the box aside and opened it to the first page and tilted it to the firelight and began to read. The handwriting was a woman's, small and neat at the start. September. They've finally approved the winter season. Carl, Dennis, and Sam arrive Thursday. We are the only cold-weather canine endurance station between here and the Yukon, and now we get to prove it was worth the money. Pages of it. Notes about the dogs, 6 of them at first, the bloodlines, the cold trials, how long an animal could hold its body heat at 20 below, at 30. Numbers, diagrams, the dry, careful language of someone in love with her work. Then the handwriting changed. December. The funding is gone. A letter came on the last supply run. They are closing us down, effective immediately, and they want everyone out before the pass is shut. The men are packing the truck tonight. They want me to come. I told them I will follow in the morning with the last of the dogs. I cannot fit 6 dogs and 4 people and a winter's worth of equipment in one truck on these roads. Carl said I was being stubborn. Carl is right, but I will not load them like cordwood and risk losing them on the grade. Della turned the page. Her mouth had gone dry. December later. The men did not make the highway. A logging crew found the truck this morning 2 miles below the second switchback off the road and into the gorge. All 3. The crew came up to tell me and to take me out. The snow was already coming. I told them I would not leave the dogs and they could not take 6 dogs in their rig and they could not make me go. They thought I was mad with grief. Maybe I was. They left me a side of bacon and a sack of flour and they went back down the mountain. And the storm closed the road behind them. And now it is only me and the dogs and this fire. The fire popped. Juniper had not moved, but its eyes were open, fixed on Della, and she had the strangest feeling that the dog knew exactly which page she was reading. She read on, and the warmth of the fire seemed very far away. The woman's name was Elena Hartman. Nell, the men had called her. And Nell Hartman had been pregnant that winter, alone in this building, snowed in with 6 dogs and 3 fresh graves she could not dig in the frozen ground. She wrote about the cold. She wrote about rationing the flour. She wrote about how, one by one, she let the other dogs go, opened the door and let them run for the deep woods to fend for themselves because she could not feed them and could not watch them starve. All but one. One would not leave her side. One pressed against her every night and gave her its warmth and would not go. Della already knew the dog's name before she read it. She knew it the way you know the end of a song you've heard your whole life. Juniper will not leave. I have stopped asking her to. The entries got shorter. The handwriting got worse. Nell was running out of food and running out of winter and the baby was coming early. She could feel it. Weeks too soon, and there was no one at all, only the dog. Della's hands shook as she turned the last written page, and she read the final entry, and the cold went all the way through her. If you are reading this, then you came in out of the storm the way I did, and you are sitting at my fire and Juniper is beside you. She is, isn't she? She always knows. She finds the ones who come in from the cold. I do not know how she lives. I have stopped trying to understand it. I only know that she stayed when no one else would, and she kept me alive, and she will keep you alive too if you let her. Trust the dog. Whatever happens tonight, trust the dog. That was the last of the writing. Della closed the notebook with both hands and held it against her chest, and she looked down at Juniper, and her eyes were wet, and the firelight swam. "You stayed," she whispered. "All this time you've been waiting." The dog put its head back down on her leg and let out a long, slow breath, like something it had carried for a very long time had finally been set down. Outside, the wind had dropped. The howling had eased to a low murmur in the eaves. The fire was steady and orange and warm, and there was wood enough for hours, and Della found an old wool blanket folded on the lowest shelf and dragged it over the both of them. She tucked it around her belly and around the bony length of the dog. Her eyes were so heavy. She thought, before morning I'll be cold again and I'll feed the fire, and by daylight the storm will break, and Ruth will have sent someone and they'll see the smoke. We're going to be all right. We made it. The hard part is over. For the first time in 6 weeks, Della Marsh felt something close to safe. And then the pain hit her like a fist closing around her spine. It came out of nowhere and doubled her over and drove the breath out of her in a sound she didn't recognize as her own. Every muscle in her belly went hard as the river stone at her back. She grabbed her middle with both arms and rode it, gasping, while it built and then, slowly, let her go. She knew what it was. Of course she knew. She'd been to the classes in town with the other mothers before Tom died, before any of this. She just hadn't believed it could happen now. Now here, weeks early, in a dead place in the middle of a frozen mountain with no doctor and no road and no one in the world who knew where she was. This wasn't about freezing anymore. The fire had won that fight. This was something else entirely. Something her body had decided to do whether the world was ready or not. And the world was about as far from ready as it could get. Then a warm gush soaked through her clothes onto the hearthstones, and there was no more pretending. "No," she said. "No, no, not yet. It's too early, please." She was talking to her body, to the baby, to Tom, to God, to anyone. Please, not here. Juniper was on its feet. The dog didn't pace and didn't whine now. It moved with a purpose, a terrible old purpose, like it had done this before and remembered every step. It went to the woodpile and back, then to a low cabinet under the long table, and it stood there and pawed at the door and looked back at Della and barked, one sharp bark that cracked through the room. "What?" she gasped. "What is it?" It barked again at the cabinet. She remembered the notebook, "Trust the dog." She got herself across the floor on her hands and knees between the contractions and she pulled the cabinet open. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth and waxed paper and tied with twine, was a kit, a birthing kit. Clean folded cloths, gone stiff but dry and clean, a small bottle of alcohol, a short, sharp knife, a coil of clean string, a pair of scissors, and a card in Nell Hartman's hand that said, "For the next one, boil the water if you can. Tie the cord in 2 places before you cut. The dog will keep the baby warm. Let her." Della pressed the card to her mouth and let out a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. Nell had known. Nell had survived this exact thing in this exact room, and she had packed a kit and hidden it where the next freezing woman would find it, and she had trusted a dog to lead her to it. And the dog had. If you're still with me, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because I promise you, what Juniper does in the next few minutes is the part of this story nobody believes the first time they hear it. The next contraction took her down to the floor. She got the cloths spread out on the hearth, close to the fire, in the warm. She got her wet clothes off her lower half and pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders. Her whole body was one long shudder now, fear and cold, and the deep animal work of what was happening to her. She had no idea what she was doing. She'd never done this. She'd planned a hospital, a doctor, Tom in the hallway wearing a hole in the floor. None of that existed anymore. There was only the fire and the cloths and the knife and the dog. "Okay," she panted. "Okay, Nell, okay, Juniper, we're doing this, we're doing this." The hours that followed, Della would never be able to put in order. There was the fire, which she fed when she could reach the wood and which burned low and red when she couldn't. There was the pain, which stopped being something that happened to her and became the only thing in the whole world. There was the dog always, pressed against her side or standing over her, licking the sweat off her face, leaning its weight into her when she needed something to push against. When she screamed, Juniper did not flinch. When she wept and said she couldn't do it, she was going to die here like the men in the gorge. The dog put its cold nose against her cheek and held it there until she breathed again. The night turned over. Somewhere out in the dark, the storm spent the last of itself against the mountain. And just before dawn, in the lowest, coldest hour, with the fire down to coals and her body torn open and her voice gone to a rasp, Della Marsh gave one last long push and felt her child come into the world. And then there was silence. Terrible silence. The baby lay in the firelight on the clean cloth, small, far too small, blue-gray and slick and still, and it did not cry, and it did not move. Della's heart stopped in her chest. "No," she breathed. "No, no, breathe, please breathe." She remembered from 100 years ago, from a classroom in town, clear the airway. Her finger swept the tiny mouth. Nothing. The baby lay there in the dying light, and Della felt the whole night, the whole crash, the whole terrible 6 weeks since Tom, gathering itself to fall on her at once. Juniper shoved her aside. The dog put its head down to the baby and began to lick. Hard, rough, fast, the whole side of the little body, the chest, the back, turning it half over with its nose, licking and nudging and licking. Exactly the way a dog cleans a newborn pup, exactly the way it must have done in this room 15 years before. Della watched, frozen, her hand over her mouth. The baby's arms jerked. The little chest hitched, caught, hitched again. And then the room filled with the thin, furious, beautiful, outraged wail of a living child taking its first lungful of cold mountain air and hating every bit of it. Della was sobbing too hard to see. She gathered the baby up against her bare chest and pulled the wool blanket over the both of them, and Juniper pressed in along her other side, and the three of them lay in a heap by the coals, while the baby screamed its small, fierce protest at being alive. It was a girl. A tiny, perfect, early living girl, with a shock of dark hair plastered to her head and 10 fingers and 10 toes, and a set of lungs that carried clear up the chimney and out into the breaking dawn. Della did what the card said. She tied the cord in 2 places with the clean string, her hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries each, and she cut it with the knife she dipped in the alcohol. She wrapped the baby in the white knitted hat that Nell had left 15 years ago for the next one, and it fit, and that broke something open in her all over again. "Hi," she whispered to her daughter when the screaming finally settled into snuffling and the small face turned blind toward the warmth of her. "Hi, I've got you, we made it." Juniper licked the baby's head once, gently, and then laid its own head down across Della's legs between her and the door, the way it must have lain 1,000 nights, guarding what it had decided to guard. And it closed its pale eyes. And it let out a long, slow, contented breath. That breath was the last sound the dog ever made. When Della reached down to stroke its head, a little while later in the gray light of the morning, the old dog was gone. It had done the thing it had stayed alive all those years to do. It had found one more person who came in from the cold, and it had kept her alive, and it had brought her child into the world. And then, its work finally finished, it had simply let go. Della held her sleeping daughter against her heart and laid her other hand on the still, gray side of the dog, and she cried for a long time. For Juniper, for Nell, for the 3 men in the gorge, for Tom, for all of it. The fire popped and settled. Outside, for the first time in 2 days, the sky began to clear. They found her near noon. Ruth had called the sheriff's office at midnight when Della never arrived, and the sheriff had called the logging company, and the logging company had a man who knew the old research road and knew the cut through. And at first light, a crew had started up the mountain on a snow cat, following the line of a wrecked truck somebody had spotted from the valley. They came up the road expecting the worst. What they didn't expect was the thread of wood smoke rising straight and thin into the still morning air from a chimney that hadn't smoked in 15 years. The man who shouldered the door open would tell the story for the rest of his life. A woman by a dead fire, wrapped in an old wool blanket, alive. A newborn baby against her chest, alive, in a little yellowed hat. And an old gray husky lying across her legs, facing the door, as though it had died on watch. They carried Della and the baby down the mountain wrapped in everything warm they had. She would not let go of the tin box, and she would not let them leave the dog behind, and they were good men, and they didn't argue with either thing. At the hospital in Missoula, the doctors shook their heads and used words like asterisk miracle asterisk and asterisk impossible, and I don't know how either of you is alive. Ruth wept in the hallway. The baby, 4 pounds and stubborn as winter, held on and grew and got loud and got pink. When they asked Della what she was going to name her, she didn't hesitate. Alina, she said, Nell for short. She tracked down what there was to track down later when she was strong again. There really had been a cold weather research station, closed abruptly one winter long ago after 3 of its scientists died on the grade. There really had been a Dr. Alina Hartman, who'd been reported lost that same winter and then walked out of the mountains the following spring, alone, carrying an infant, refusing to ever say much about how she'd survived. She had lived a long, quiet life and died only the year before, an old woman in a town 2 valleys over. She'd left no instructions about the station. She just left a box behind a fireplace and a kit in a cabinet and a dog that wouldn't leave. Della never could explain the dog, the age of it, how a husky could have lived 15 winters half-starved and alone in that dead place. The vet who looked it over for the burial just shook his head and said the animal was old, impossibly old, older than a dog like that had any right to be, and that some things you don't get to understand, you only get to be grateful for. She buried Juniper on a south-facing slope where the spring sun would reach it early, and she set a flat river stone over the grave, and on it she had a man in town carve one word, just the name. She kept the photograph on the mantel of her own house after that, the 3 squinting men and the dark-haired woman and the young dog in its prime, and she told her daughter the story of it every winter, when the snow came down and the wind got up in the eaves. How a truck went off an icy road. How a freezing woman crawled toward a cold stone fireplace because it was the only thing left to crawl toward. How a half-wild dog came out of the dark and would not leave her side. And how, behind that fireplace, a stranger 15 years dead had reached forward through time to keep them both alive. The story always started the same way, with the action of it, the cold and the crash and the dark. But it always ended somewhere quieter. Because Nell had been right in the end about the only thing that ever really mattered up on that mountain. Some things will stay when everything else runs for the woods. Some things will keep you warm with the last heat in their own thin bodies and ask for nothing back. And every so often, if you are very lost and very cold and very near the end of what you can take, something old and patient and good comes out of the dark to find you. You just have to make it to the fire, and you have to trust the dog.